I'm going to keep it simple because I know the biggest hurdle when you're eyeing a new 3D printer is figuring out whether it actually fits into the workflow you already have, and whether the headline numbers translate into real-world savings. If you're still on the fence about a multi-toolhead machine, you'll want to hear about the quirks that show up after the box is opened, not just the marketing copy. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. When I first saw the FLASHFORGE Creator 5, the 4 independent toolheads and the promise of a near-zero waste system were the parts that caught my attention. In the hobbyist community, the usual compromise is either a single extruder that switches filaments mid-print, which can leave ghost lines, or a dual extruder that forces you to share the same hot end temperature. The Creator 5 claims to eliminate that compromise by letting you load 4 completely separate filaments and swap them in just 7 seconds. That's a bold claim, and the real question is how that actually feels when you're trying to print a functional prototype that needs a soluble support or a multicolor aesthetic. First off, the unpacking experience is surprisingly smooth. The printer arrives in a sturdy case, and the assembly is limited to attaching the toolhead carriage to the CoreXY frame, plugging in the power and USB cables, and then running the auto-calibration routine. The auto-calibration takes about 5 minutes, and the machine does a decent job of probing the bed without you having to manually adjust screws. That's a genuine time saver, especially if you're a small business owner who wants to get a print job started after a client call. The calibration also stores the bed mesh, so you rarely have to repeat it unless you move the printer. The 4 toolheads are each mounted on their own carriage, which means each can be preheated to a different temperature before a swap. In practice, the intelligent preheating feature works by letting you cue the next filament, and the printer brings that hot end to the target temperature while the current print continues. I tested this with a PLA main part, a TPU flexible support, a PETG brace, and a soluble PVA support all in one build. The swap itself is almost cinematic. The carriage slides out, the new toolhead snaps into place, and the print resumes within 7 seconds. The transition is clean enough that you don't see any ghost lines or misalignments, which is a major win for anyone who needs fine detail across multiple materials. Now, the near-zero waste claim is where the value proposition starts to show its teeth. The system uses a filament recovery unit that pulls back the unused filament when a tool change occurs, which the manufacturer says reduces waste by up to 80%. In my test, I printed a lattice structure that used PVA as a support material. Normally, you'd end up with a spool of partially used filament that's difficult to reuse because it's been exposed to heat. With the Creator 5, the unused PVA is automatically res-pooled into a separate bin, and I was able to reload that same filament for a later print with no noticeable degradation. The savings are tangible if you run a lot of support-heavy models. For occasional hobby prints the system feels a bit over-engineered, but the waste reduction is still a nice bonus. Speed is another headline feature, 600 mm per second CoreXY motion. That number can be misleading if you think the printer will blast through any model at that velocity. The firmware caps the speed based on the filament type and the geometry you're printing. In my experience, PLA parts printed at 300 mm per second still retained crisp edges, while PETG and TPU required dropping to around 150 mm per second to avoid layer adhesion issues. The CoreXY architecture does give you smoother direction changes compared to a traditional Cartesian design, which becomes evident on curved surfaces. Those turns feel less jittery. If you're looking for raw throughput and you're comfortable tweaking slicer settings, the speed is a genuine advantage. One hidden trade-off is the footprint. Because you have 4 independent heads, the carriage is wider and the overall printer occupies a larger volume on the bench. It fits comfortably in a standard home office, but you'll need to clear at least a 2-foot square around it for the toolhead swings. That's something to keep in mind if you live in a cramped apartment studio. Additionally, the filament recovery bin adds another moving part. I noticed that after a few dozen swaps, the res-pool motor occasionally hesitated, requiring a brief pause in the print to let it catch up. It wasn't a fatal error, but it does add a tiny layer of maintenance you wouldn't have with a singly extruder machine. The price point sits in the upper mid-range for consumer-grade printers, and the 4.2-star rating from over 900 reviewers reflects a generally positive sentiment with a few consistent complaints. Most of the negative feedback that shows up in the review count revolves around the learning curve of managing 4 filaments and the occasional filament jam in the recovery system. If you're a beginner who has never calibrated a printer before, you might